All right, so now we are starting the endocrine systems healthcare terminology. So, what you see on the screen right here is what we would call the primary endocrine glands. There are more glands and structures that exist in the body that have endocrine function, but right here is primary endocrine organs. Another thing to consider, we are missing one very important organ here within the brain. Right above the pituitary, right where the pointer of my mouse is where there's an organ called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus actually kind of controls the pituitary gland, and together those two essentially control the rest of the endocrine organs. So going through this here, glands in general, the combining form for that is adeno. We covered the thymus in the lymphatic system. That is thymo. Remember, the thymus is the location where T lymphocytes are matured and undergo a essentially test before they are released. Thyroid. This one's actually very straightforward. It's thyroid. That's literally the root for thyroid. The thyroid gland, very important role in metabolism. People with hypothyroidism have very fast metabolism. People with hypothyroidism have very slow. The adrenal glands. These are bilateral. They sit on top of each kidney. Because of that, they can actually sometimes be called suprarenal glands. So if you break that word down, supra means above, renal is applicable to the kidney. So suprarenal means above the kidney. But normally they're only referred to as adrenal glands. We would use adrenal O. The adrenal glands have a wide range of function. They produce 4 different categories of hormones. We have a lot of corticoids, as well as very low levels of androgens produced here. Corticoids tend to play a role in regulation of fluid in the body. They can help with inflammation. They can help keep salt balances, things of that nature. And they do that actually by kind of acting on the kidneys, and it makes sense then that they're right there. Another thing to go through, pancreas is here. Pancreas plays a major role in digestion. It releases what's literally called pancreatic, it releases enzymes into the what's called the duodenum of the small intestine, and those enzymes help in digestion. But there's also several highly specialized cells in the pancreas. Alpha cells release a hormone called glucagon, and beta cells release insulin. These play a major role in helping the body facilitate digestion, because remember, when we digest food, the whole idea is we're bringing energy into the body. Well, glucagon and insulin do 2 very opposite things. Insulin, you can think of as a storage hormone. So it's very great to secrete insulin when we eat, because it's going to upregulate the entire body's ability to bring in energy. Glucagon, on the other hand, very important in fasting conditions. Glucagon helps the liver and the muscle break down stored energy. It's also going to help break down fatty tissues and undergo a highly specialized process to convert the fat to energy. And then we obviously have the what would be called the primary sex organs, and those are the testes in men and the ovaries in females. They serve the same purpose essentially, but they secrete different hormones. So ovaries, you're looking at estrogen, progesterone primarily, and testes, you're looking at androgens, specifically different forms of testosterone. So, as I mentioned before, here in the brain, we actually have three. I said two earlier, but one of them's not as important. So there's the hypothalamus, which is actually a region of the brain, the pituitary gland, and these two are connected. And the pituitary gland, if you look at it, it's got two different components to it. The anterior pituitary, also called the adenohypophysis. And when we break down adenohypophysis, remember adeno means gland, right? So that would say that the anterior pituitary is glandular tissue. Hypophysis, talk about that, we're basically talking about the hypothalamus when we say that. Now, what gets interesting is the posterior pituitary is called the neurohypophysis. The posterior pituitary is actually nervous tissue. In fact, there's literally neurons from the hypothalamus that essentially are what make up the neurohypophysis. The anterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus via what's called the hypophyseal portal system. It's just a blood vessel network. And to get even more interesting here, the anterior pituitary, being a glandular tissue, actually in development comes from a completely different tissue than the neurohypophysis. And we should be able to know that because one's neuro and one's glandular. And believe it or not, the anterior pituitary actually develops from the oral mucosa. Very, very interesting process. But the third gland, obviously not as important. It still plays a major role in many processes of the body. So I shouldn't say it's not important. But the pineal gland secretes melatonin. And most of us have probably heard of melatonin. It plays a major role in what's called circadian rhythms. So that's like our sleep-wake cycle, and any other process in the body that relies on timing, right? So in females, it's very important in both the ovarian and the uterine cycles. But when you compare it to the hypothalamus and the pituitary, it's got a lot less function. So looking here, the pituitary is normally called the master gland. Remember, the pituitary, for the most part, is stimulated by the hypothalamus. We can kind of think about that relationship, though, to simplify it. It's like the hypothalamus is more of a sensor, and the pituitary is the one that really carries out functions. You'll see a bunch of hormones here. The ones in blue primarily are only from the posterior pituitary, whereas the purple are from the anterior pituitary. There are more hormones released from both of these glands. These are just the big ones. Now, the hypothalamus will release what's called hormones that are going to stimulate the pituitary. So if we have thyroid stimulating hormone released from the pituitary, what you actually have being released from the hypothalamus is thyroid stimulating releasing hormone. Okay? It actually can get relatively confusing, but it tells you exactly what it's telling the pituitary to release. Next here, the pancreas. Now, I mentioned the pancreas earlier, and within the pancreas, we have what's called the islets of Langerhans, or Langerhans. As you're looking at this tissue here, the yellow is what we would literally just say is standard pancreatic tissue. The islet of Langerhans is where we actually have the endocrine function. This is where alpha and beta cells exist. Now, there's also other endocrine cells within the islets and within this standard tissue, but their hormonal function isn't fully understood yet. And this is stuff like the hormone leptin and ghrelin. They're believed to actually be released from cells here in the pancreas as well, but we don't quite fully understand how they work yet. So, the thyroid is interesting because it has a set of what's called parathyroid glands. These are also endocrine tissue. They're four separate glands, and they literally sit on the back of the thyroid. And what parathyroid glands do, and they're highly specialized for this, they actually are primarily responsible for maintaining calcium balance in the body. So when we talk about bone conditions related to, poor calcium deposition, like osteoporosis, for example, we want to look at the parathyroid hormone level as part of that investigation, because it is very possible parathyroid is having a dysfunction of some kind. So, functions of the endocrine system are large-ranging. It's another way that the body communicates, and if you think about it, our body can communicate in two ways: via the nervous system, which is very fast, and the signal to do something only exists as long as there is action in the nervous system, which is just electrical signals. Now, the endocrine system is a slower response, but it tends to be a lot stronger, and it's going to be long-term, okay? But primarily what we see is it really does regulate body activity by secreting hormones. And these are going to have influence on growth, development, and metabolism, especially when we talk about the hypothalamus, pituitary, and thyroid, and the that would be called the HPT, or the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. And then we have the HPA, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So, getting into combining forms. Adrenal is the adrenal gland, as we've already covered. Crino is to secrete. So if we look at the word endocrinology, what would that mean? Well, endo means within. Crino is to secrete, and ology is the study of. So we're talking about the ability to secrete within, and by adding an extra word, we're talking about the study of the body's hormonal secretions, right? Dipso, this means thirst. This is important for diabetes, as excess thirst is a symptom of diabetes. And diabetes is an endocrine disorder related to the body not being able to produce enough insulin. And this inability to produce enough insulin is directly related to excess carbohydrate intake, excess caloric intake in general. And we see not only does the blood sugar reach a certain point where the pancreas literally does not have enough beta cells to make insulin. The pancreas caps out on its insulin production, yet the blood glucose level keeps increasing a ridiculous amount. And that's how you get symptoms of diabetes. But we also end up with what would be called insulin resistance, where receptors on cells that should be intaking extra glucose, like muscles or the liver, they actually require a lot more insulin just to start intaking glucose. Next, we have glyco, means sugar. So we talk about like glucose or another specific process in the body called glycolysis, which is the creation of energy from glucose. Thymo is directly related to the thymus gland. Now, thymo is an interesting one because it actually officially translates from its Latin base as meaning like mind or emotion, and we're not using it in that sense here. It's literally just about thymus. Now, there are disorders called dysthymic disorders. Those are actually mood disorders. Okay, so those are psychiatric and is something that you would look at in nervous system or psychiatric anatomy and physiology or psychiatric diseases. And then again, a thyroid gland, very simple. The name is literally it. What we have for a suffix is ism, just simply means state of. So we go through here. Acromegaly. Acromegaly is a condition where the adrenal gland, or not the adrenal gland, I'm sorry, the pituitary gland is releasing excess growth hormone. But this condition only happens in adulthood. And what happens with acromegaly is that since growth plates in the bone is sealed, the bones can only get thicker, they can only get wider. So people with acromegaly, you tend to see having incredibly wide and thick bones, large, prominent facial features, stuff of that nature, right? Now, what happens if the pituitary is releasing excess growth hormone in childhood when the bone's growth plates haven't sealed? That's when we get gigantism, because the bones can grow longer. They'll also still grow thicker. And that's how you end up with people like Andre the Giant, who, you know, you're these very, very tall, but also very, very wide, large people. Adenoma. This is just like a enlarged, swollen gland. Adrenalectomy. It's a removal of an adrenal gland. Adrenalitis, inflammation of the adrenals. Endocrine. Again, we covered this. It's within the secretion within. So we talk about like endocrinology is the study of secretions within the body. Okay, so endocrinology, we should already know, our brains should already be working and seeing what these mean. Endocrinopathy is a disease of the endocrine. Glycemia essentially is talking about a condition related to sugar. So you talk about hypoglycemia, too little, hyperglycemia, too much. Now, this picture that we see here, this person actually has acromegaly. So you notice the very wide, tall, prominent facial features, the enlarged fingers, things of that nature. It's a very obvious condition when we see it. So now going through hyperglycemia is too much, too high of sugar. We actually use it specifically for blood sugar levels. Hyperthyroidism, too much thyroid hormone, which causes an increased metabolism. Hypoglycemia, too little blood sugar. Hypothyroidism is a reduced level of thyroid hormone, which means a reduced metabolism. Polydipsia. Now, this means excess thirst, right? And again, polydipsia is a symptom of diabetes. Polyuria is excess urination. This can be a symptom of diabetes and of diabetes mellitus, which is what we typically refer to, typically what we know of as diabetes, but it can also be a symptom of what's called diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus is actually not related to the pancreas, and it's a condition related to the pituitary gland and the hormone, antidiuretic hormone, which can also sometimes be called vasopressin. Thymectomy is a removal of the thymus. Thymic is just pertaining to the thymus. Thymoma. Thyroidectomy. Now, this can happen with certain thyroid conditions like hyperthyroidism. We can remove the thyroid and put the patient on a synthetic thyroid hormone. Brand name of is Synthroid. Very clever name. Fake thyroid is literally what that means. Thyroiditis is inflammation of the thyroid. Now, we have some terms here that don't have word parts. So, Addison's disease, diabetes mellitus. Now, remember, diabetes mellitus is type 1, type 2. Type 1 is the body doesn't produce insulin at all. Type 2 is the insulin resistance and the inability to produce enough insulin. The fasting blood sugar, we use that test to help look at diabetes diagnosis. Glycated hemoglobin, this is the A1C level, again, used in monitoring and diagnosis of diabetes. A goiter. Now, goiters are interesting because they're a symptom, well, they technically are a standalone condition as well, but they're an enlargement of the thyroid, and it can happen for several different reasons, believe it or not. And when it enlarges, you get a very large, wide extension from the anterior part of the neck. And one of the primary reasons goiters used to happen is we didn't get enough iodine in our diet. And if you go to your kitchen right now, I'm willing to bet if you have salt in your kitchen, it is iodized. That is one of the first uses of what we would call modern public health. We iodized table salt, and the prevalence of goiters decreased significantly. Now, goiters can also happen when you have hyperthyroidism, and they can also happen from hypothyroidism as well. Graves' disease is a autoimmune version of hyperthyroidism. It can cause a lot of problems. One of the most obvious features of it is people tend to have eye sockets that sink in a little bit, but their eyes actually start to protrude out. So you get this exaggerated protrusion of the eye. So, I looked here. I mentioned this already. Two major forms of diabetes. Type 1, you can think of it as juvenile onset. You're typically born with it. We don't exactly know why it happens. We think that it could be related to the body's immune system having a autoimmune type response to the beta cells. But again, we don't really know. Now, type 2 is what we typically see as diabetes on TV. It sometimes can be called non-insulin dependent. It's really more related to lifestyle, poor exercise, poor diet, excess caloric intake, and then we end up getting insulin resistance within the body, where the body requires a lot more insulin to be secreted. In fact, it requires a lot more insulin than the pancreas can even create. So it's an impossible scenario. Now, this slide says here you can call it adult onset diabetes, but that's not accepted anymore. There is, unfortunately, a very significant increase in the number of children that have begun being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Very unfortunate. Now, type 1 can't be reversed. Type 2 can be reversed, especially if you're in a pre-diabetic state or have a short period of diagnosis. Like you just got diagnosed, you can really turn it around. Now, people that have had type 2 diabetes for a decade, it takes a lot more work, and there will be permanent damage as a result of it, because type 2 diabetes causes a lot of neurological damage in the body. That's why people have issues with their eyes. People have problems with nerves in their feet. And you get damage to blood vessels as well. It's not a fun condition to have for a long time, especially if it's very severe. So type 1 diabetes, again, just talked about it. The beta cells of the pancreas that make insulin, they get destroyed. We don't exactly know why this happens. As I mentioned before, it typically starts in childhood or adolescence, but there are people that get diagnosed with it in their early 20s. Type 2 diabetes, this is a resistance and a inability of the body to meet insulin requirements. The longer you have the condition, the more symptoms you'll have and the more permanent complications you end up. And again, if you see here on the treatment, diet, exercise, the 2 first lines of treatment. Typically, once you get on diabetes medications, you're in a very bad state. And we have to remember, since the cause is lifestyle, people with type 2 diabetes tend to have other conditions. They can have issues with obesity, high blood pressure, different cardiac problems. You can have a heart disease. And all of that must be considered in their treatment plan for diabetes. What we see here is a goiter. So notice how the thyroid would be kind of outlined here normally, the butterfly-shaped organ of the thyroid. Well, it's expanded. It's now a much wider organ. Again, it can be caused by hyper or hypo. It can also be caused by special thyroid conditions like Graves' disease or Hashimoto's thyroiditis. In the past, iodine deficiency was a common reason. We typically only see iodine deficiency these days in underdeveloped or developing countries. We see here A1C, DM, FBS. Those are abbreviations. So we're looking here, a glycometer. This is what people with various forms of diabetes use to measure their blood sugar. So what we see here, a laboratory test to look at the indication of blood sugar over the past 3 months. This is important because it's going to give you a true pattern to diagnose diabetes. We can take a regular fasting blood sugar, an FBC, but that's only for right now, right then. A1C is great because it allows us to really look at the last 120 days. And without going too in depth, it's because a red blood cell tends to live at least 120 days. So we can test the A1C level based on the red blood cell. Okay? So that is all for the endocrine system.